journey continues, and already we're up to Easter 5. Lovely to have you with us. Chris Holmes back with us again, and Jenny Dawson, Pukerua Bay, and in Green Island. Chris, you've got some background. I find this a fascinating little passage because we've just gone from darkness, the door shutting, Judas going out, and then we've got a whole lot of stuff about love and glory. Help me with this.
Thanks. The theme of glorification matters a great deal to John, as I'm sure many folks know. Glory, glorification, and especially the second half of his gospel is preoccupied with how the Son will glorify the Father in going to die a brutal and ignominious death. And so as we try to wrap our heads and hearts around what's going on here, I think we have to take that motif really seriously, that the Son will continue to glorify the Father as he has done, but he will do so by dying and by acquiescing to the verdict that Judas and many others are pronouncing and will continue to pronounce on him. And so we've got to keep that front and center, and that really grounds the business about loving one another, is that that love that Christ commands helps us to share in the glory he has with the Father, and it shows others that we are from him and that he is from the Father. And so this lovely little passage is helping us to indwell this great reality of love and union that exists between the Father and the Son and Christian disciples.
John doesn't do anything by halves, does he? He really saturates his words. So let's go to Anne, and how, apart from the fact that it's a very little passage and some of these other passages aren't, but tell me about some challenge for you there.
I think the biggest challenge is that Jesus makes such a big deal about us being known for our love, and we're not. And so the challenge is, why aren't we, and what can we do about it? And thinking here that perhaps we need as a church to take learning how to love seriously, almost as if it's a kind of skill that we need to upskill on. And, maybe the challenge could be, how do we as God's people learn what love looks like when there's conflict? And how do we learn what love looks like when someone has offended us? And how do we learn what love looks like when we're in a position of power or influence? And just maybe if we got better at loving, then people would look at us and say, wow, they're Christians, they love. And those two things could come together in the public consciousness a little bit more than they presently do.
And certainly John's making clear in his telling that this is no superficial process that he's speaking of. Jenny, for you, where do you find challenge here?
I think I'm going to pick up loving later on in one of the other questions, but the challenge comes in the first few words for me. When he had gone out, Jesus said, and I hope whoever reads it in church reads, when Judas had gone out, and doesn't just put he in, because it's a little confusing. But the thing that really challenges me is that Jesus has related so intimately with Judas, washed his feet with everybody else, shared bread with him with everybody else, and then talks about what's going to happen, do what you have to do. And then he went out and Jesus switches straight into talking, deepens the conversation really. Now is the Son of Man glorified, and in him God is glorified, as Chris has been alluding to. And I just cannot get my head around that staying in the moment that Jesus is able to do. He's dealt with something absolutely massive with Judas. I mean, somebody described Judas as dead man walking at this point, and that's certainly true. But Jesus then moves straight into something so incredibly important, God being glorified, and then the instruction about love one another. But I think Jesus' ability to stay with what needs to be stayed with at the time is something I long for.
Quite remarkable. So Chris, tell us personally what you encounter in this little scene.
Well, that's a straightforward question. Quite a bit, really. Sort of the deep sort of theological metaphysics at work, the relationship between the Father and the Son, and at the same time, how we as Christians are to love as the Son loves us. And so on a very sort of personal and pastoral level, I find that immensely challenging to love in a cruciform way, and to love in a way that testifies to the intimacy of the Father and the Son and the Father and the Father and the Son. And so my hope and prayer ultimately is that the love that God's Spirit blesses me with points to its source, that is the triune God. And so I think the challenge here in this really rich little passage is to hold together the deep sort of Trinitarian insights going on, and how the Father-Son relationship compels a form of life amongst disciples that's appropriate to it. Jesus is talking about love between Christians, and the world is going to know, says Jesus, that you're from me if you love in the way that I love. And the way I love is by glorifying my Father, our Father. So I think the challenge is to see that love doesn't come from this no man's land. It is the way in which through the Spirit we participate in the Father-Son relationship.
And as you said, there's the very tough, this very cruciform shape of love that leaves no wriggle room for superficiality. Jenny, for you, I want to come to a sense of good news now. It's easy to gloss over it. Where is the good news? It's a dark moment. Judas has gone out.
Well, again, I probably chose something that others mightn't see as good news. If you look at, where are we? Little children, verse 33. Yet a little while I am with you. It's like one of those death scenes with the farewell speech that we've got a number of times in the Bible, but this is so tender, and that sets the scene for what Jesus says about love one another. And I think the good news is that Jesus's gentleness, tenderness, preparing the disciples is there for us too. And this is so precious and intimate. So that's my good news.
So a powerful sense of tenderness and the extent of that good news. Chris, I'll come back to you. There's no pattern here. Good news.
Yeah, I think that the good news in part is that Jesus remains faithful. Where I am going, you cannot come. I'm going to the cross. And to Peter will, as Jesus says in John chapter 21, he will die a death that the kind of death that he doesn't want to die. And so there's good news that Jesus is faithful to God, to the will of his Father unto death. That is the heart of our salvation. Of course, he's raised from death. He raises himself, the Father raises him, the Spirit raises him. So there's good news in his absolute fidelity.
Powerful stuff. And good news.
I want to dig a bit more into this glory word. I remember, Mike, when we were in the Northern Territory and they were trying to translate the Bible into various Aboriginal languages, trying to work out how to translate the word glory. And I know one kind of could get translated back into English as really shiny. And yet so much more. And the link here between the glory of Jesus and the glory of God in the temple, which was really shiny, but also really quite dangerous in its holiness, but showed in the Shekinah God's presence with them. And here we have Jesus, where that glory is veiled in flesh, like the herald angels, that the right Carol has, so that Jesus can be with us safely, I guess, so they can be right in the midst with his disciples. And then the idea that he is glorified all the way through John whenever he is acting, whenever he is kind of giving of himself. And so Judas goes off to betray him, and Jesus knows that this is the point where the ultimate glorification is going to happen, because it's the ultimate self-giving. And so this is, the good news here is Jesus pouring himself out for the world, for us. And that's pretty amazing.
Now let's move then to implications for today, the so what. And Jenny, for you, where do you find a so what here?
So what for me has to be where Anne started, with the love one another, because that's the bit that I want to take away and of course dwell on at a deep level. The modeling of Jesus and the way he loves, and this whole scene is just incredible. The model of foot washing, including foot washing the betrayer, the faith community, the glorify, and And I think we haven't got a clue really about what love one another means. So I sit with that, and to let Jesus, this Jesus who we've seen in these few verses, to let that Jesus show through us and through our community is the so what for me.
It's very powerful. So what? And Chris has already mentioned that the work of the Spirit enabling us in that way. We might come back to that if we have time. Anne, so what?
Yeah, I think it's the same so what. I think in many ways it is the ultimate so what for this reading. I wonder if there's something we can learn about the way the glory language and the love language are linked together. I was listening to Malcolm Guite talk about glory recently, and he said it's a little bit like a hot potato. He says you can't hold on to it, and that all the way through the Gospels, you can't glorify yourself. You can only be glorified by another. God glorifies, the Father glorifies Jesus, Jesus glorifies the Father, Jesus glorifies the disciples glorify Jesus. And that maybe if we could take us as a step in learning to love, to make a practice of recognizing the life of God in another and glorying in that might help us along the road to loving.
And Chris, a kind of a final word, because this is the so what from your perspective.
The so what, I think it has to do with, in part, the shape of discipleship as radically cruciform. And that, discipleship is about learning to die, but learning to die in and with and through Jesus Christ, who died for us so that we might no longer die. So I think it's keeping front and center the cruciform nature of discipleship and recognizing that the cross, which is that from which our life comes as Christians, that God, the Father, is glorified in the cross of his Son. So that when we love one another, we share in that by which God glorifies himself. And so I think keeping the cross front and center, and not in a romantic or in a kind of sentimental sense, but to see it what it is, as a first century instrument of Roman imperial torture. But disciples are conformed to the cross, and it's the cross of Christ, the eternally beloved Son of the Father. So to keep both sort of the life of the Father, Son, and Spirit front and center, and the kind of life that's commensurate with that, which is cruciform discipleship.
Chris, thank you. Anne, thank you. Jenny, thank you, as we find this cruciform Christ and his challenges. Thank you.